All right, let's get you prepped for your qualifying exam. We're going to do a deep dive into this really important 2023 paper from Gormley and his colleagues. Seriously, this thing gets right to the heart of how corporate governance actually changes in the real world. So let's break it down piece by piece so you can nail the key contributions. So the whole paper really boils down to this one big question. How do you actually change corporate America, right? It's not just about wishing for it. It's about the mechanics, the how. And the answer they come up with? Well, it's got this super interesting, very modern twist. Okay, here's our game plan. We're going to hit 6 key areas. We'll start with what kicked this whole thing off and go all the way to the big takeaways you'll definitely need for the exam. So, the first thing you have to get, and this is crucial, is what makes this study so different. We're not talking about government rules or new laws here. Nope. This is about a whole different kind of pressure. You see, the authors are looking at this huge shift away from public government mandated stuff, like quotas, and toward what they call private regulation. And what does that mean? It means pressure coming from some of the most powerful investors on the planet, the big index funds. And this whole thing really exploded back in 2017. That's when the big three, State Street, Vanguard, and BlackRock, all launched these major campaigns. They went public with new policies, and here's the kicker, they basically threatened to vote against directors at companies that didn't get on board. That's real power. Okay, pay attention here, because this is where the paper gets really clever. This is the kind of thing they love to ask about on exams. To prove that these campaigns were the cause of the change and not just a correlation, the researchers needed an incredibly smart design. So here's the big puzzle they had to solve. The big three are index funds, right? They own a little bit of everything. So if they're putting pressure on the entire market, who's your control group? How do you find anyone to compare them to? And they solve it with a classic tool from the econometrics playbook, something called difference in differences, or, diff and diff. The idea is pretty straightforward. You just compare how things changed for a group that got the treatment versus a group that didn't over the same stretch of time. Here's the brilliant part. The authors realized the campaigns weren't hitting everyone equally. They had specific targets. State Street, for example, went after companies with 0 women on their boards. BlackRock went after those with less than 2. And boom, suddenly you have your treatment group, the targeted firms, and your control group, the ones who already met the criteria. It's a perfect way to isolate the effect of the campaigns. All right, so with that super clever setup in place, what happened? Did this whole private pressure campaign actually, work? Oh, yeah. The answer is a huge, emphatic yes. Just look at this. We're talking about the average annual change in the number of female directors. Before the campaigns, it was ticking up slowly, like 0.08 women a year. By 2019, that number tripled. The effect wasn't just big, it was massive. Yeah. To put a hard number on it, the authors found that these campaigns pushed companies to add 2.5 times more female directors in 2019 than they did just 3 years before. I mean, think about that. That's a staggering amount of change in a super short period. Okay, but this brings up a really important question, right? Where did all these new women directors come from? And this next part is awesome because it totally debunks the classic excuse you always hear for all male boards. You know the old argument. People always say there's a supply problem, that there just aren't enough qualified women out there. If that was true, then you just see firms recycling the same few prominent women over and over, putting them on multiple boards. Sometimes they call them golden skirts. But that's not what happened. Not at all. The paper shows that once the pressure was on, companies didn't just recycle the usual suspects. Instead, they actually changed how they searched for candidates. They were forced to cast a much wider net. And the data is super clear on this. The new female directors, they were less connected to the CEO, they were less likely to have been a CEO themselves, and they were even younger. So what does that tell you? It tells you the supply of qualified women was there all along. Firms just had to be pushed to look outside their usual tiny little box of C-suite buddies. Okay, which leads us to the next big cynical question. Was this all just for show? Were these appointments just tokenism to get the big three to shut up? Or did these new directors actually get real power? Well, the evidence pretty clearly says, nope, this was not tokenism. The paper found these new directors were getting appointed to really important committees. They were even more likely to chair the powerful audit and nominating committees. That's not a symbolic job, that's real authority. All right, let's wrap this up.
If you're going to remember anything for the exam, it's these next 2 points. This is the core of the whole paper, what makes it so important. First, this is a classic case of voice versus exit. Think about it. Index funds can't just exit, they can't just sell their shares if they're unhappy, because they have to own the entire market. So their only real power is their voice, engaging with companies and, most importantly, voting their shares. And man, this paper shows just how powerful that voice can be when they use it. And the second big lesson, it just blows up the whole debate around diversity. That whole pipeline problem excuse, yeah, it turns out it was really a search problem. When firms were actually forced to look, guess what? They found plenty of qualified women. The supply was there all along. So that leaves us with a really fascinating thought to chew on. If shareholder voice can work this well for a simple, easy-to-track metric like gender on boards, what's next? What other easy-to-monitor issues could they tackle? This paper really opens the door to a whole new era of shareholder power. Something to think about.